Section 14 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Parson Jack's Fortune. Part 1. From Langona church tower you see nothing of the Atlantic but a wedge between two cliffs of a sandy creek. The cottages, 30 in all perhaps, huddle in a semicircle of the hills about a spring of clear water, which overflows and leaps as from a platform into the hollow coombe, its conduit down to the sands. But Langona church stands out more boldly on a high grassy meadow thrust forward like a bastion over the stream's right flank. It has no tree, no habitation between it and the ocean. It breaks the northerly gales for the cottages behind and under its lee, and these gales have given its tamarisk hedge and even its gravestones so noticeable a slant inward that by a trick of eyesight the church itself seems tilted perilously forward. Forward in fact, that is to say, seaward. The tower does lean, though but a foot or so, and now not perilously, the salt winds impotent against its masonry, having bitten with more effect into the earth around its base. But the church has been restored, the mischief arrested, and the danger no longer haunts its vicar as it haunted the Reverend Jack Flood on a bright September morning in 1885. He sat on a time-covered hummock by the valley stream, with knees drawn up and palms pressed against his aching head. Sat, as he had been sitting for half an hour past, a shovel beside him and an empty sack which he had brought down to fill with clean river sand. A chaffinch, fresh from his bath, flitted incessantly between the rail of the footbridge a dozen yards below and the boughs of a tamarisk beside it. He paid no attention to Parson Jack. Few living creatures ever did. Even his parishioners, those who knew of it, felt no great concern that Parson Jack had been drunk again last night. There was no harm in the man. He had this failing, to be sure. With a little liquor he talked silly, though not so silly as you might suppose. Let him alone, and he'll find his way home somehow. Scandalous? Oh, no doubt. But you might easily go farther and find a worse parson than Flood. It never occurred to them that he felt any special remorse. His agonies were private, and his chance of redemption lay in this, that they neither ceased nor eased with time. Perhaps in this too, that he wasted no breath in apologetics or self-pity, but blamed himself squarely, like a man. Yet a sentimentalist in his place might have run up a long and tearful account against Providence, fate, circumstances, whatever. Sentimentalists choose to arraign rather than themselves. 25 years before, Jack Flood had been a rowdy undergraduate at Brasenose College, Oxford, in his 3rd year of residence, with more than a fair prospect of being ploughed, or, in the language of that generation, plucked at the end of it. A member of the Phoenix Wine Club, owner of a brute which he not only called a hunter, but made to do duty for one at least twice a week, and debtor amongst various Oxford tradesmen to the tune of something like £500. At this point his father, a Berkshire rector, died suddenly of a paralytic stroke, leaving Jack and his elder brother Lionel, then abroad in the new Indian civil service, to realize and divide an estate of £1,200. £600 is a fair equipment for starting a young man in life, but not when he already owes 500 and has few brains, no decided bent, and only a little of the most useless learning. Jack surrendered 2/3 of his patrimony to his pressing creditors, sold his hunter, read hard for a term, scrambled into his degree, and was received a month or two later into holy orders. His father had sent him to Brasenose College as a step to this, and Jack had looked forward to being a parson some day, a sporting parson, be it understood. For the moment, however, he was almost penniless, and he had answered in vain some dozen advertisements of curacies, when a college friend came to the rescue and prevailed on a distant kinsman to offer him the living of Langona, with a net annual stipend of £51 18s. 6d. There are such livings. It was offered, of course, and accepted merely as a stopgap. But 25 years had passed, and at Lagona Parson Flood remained. It had cost him 20 of these to wipe off his Oxford debts, with interest, but he had managed to retain the small remnant of his capital, and this, with his benefice, yielded an income better than a day labourer's. That he was still a bachelor goes without saying. In the summer he fished. In the winter he followed afoot a pack of harriers kept by his patron, Sir Harry Vile of Carwithiel. These were his recreations. He could not afford to travel, and cared little for reading. His library consisted of his Bible, 2 or 3 small divinity handbooks, a Pickwick Stonehenge on the Dog, and a couple of Handley Cross novels, with coloured illustrations by John Leech. Twice a year or thereabouts a letter reached him from his brother in Calcutta, who was apparently prospering, and had a wife and 3 children, though for some years the letters had brought no news of them. Something was wrong, Parson Jack decided after a while, finding that his messages to them met with no answer, and he felt a delicacy in asking questions. He believed that the children had been sent home to England. He did not know where, and would have liked to pay them a visit. But for him a journey was out of the question, and so he lived on, alone and forgotten. On Sundays he wore a black suit, which had lasted him for 10 years, and would have to last for another 5 at least. On weekdays he dressed in blue guernsey and corduroys, and smoked a clay pipe. His broad-brimmed clerical hat alone distinguished him from the farm labourers in his parish. But when at work upon the church, patching its shingle roof or pouring mortar into its gaping wounds, he discarded this for a maroon-coloured cap, not unlike a biretta, which offered less surface to the high winds. He knew nothing of architecture, could not in fact distinguish Norman work from Perpendicular, and at first had taken to these odd jobs of masonry as a handy way of killing time. He had wit enough, however, to learn pretty soon that the whole fabric was eaten with rot, and in danger from every gale, and by degrees, he could not explain how, the ruin had set up a claim on him. In his worst dreams he saw it toppling, falling. During the winter gales he lay awake listening, imagining the throes and shudders of its old beams, and would be abroad before daybreak, waiting for the light to assure him that it yet stood. A casual tourist, happening on him at work some summers before, had mistaken him for a hired mason, and discoursed learnedly on the beauties of the edifice and the pity of its decay. "That's a vile job you have in hand, my friend, a bit of sheer vandalism," said the tourist. "But I suppose the parson who employs you knows no better." Parson Jack had been within an ace of revealing himself, but now changed his mind, and asked humbly enough what was amiss. Whereupon the tourist pulled out a pencil and an old envelope, and explained. "But there," he broke off, "it would take me a week to go into these matters, and you a deal longer to understand. I'd enjoy 20 minutes' talk with your parson. The church wants restoration from beginning to end, and by a first-class man. It deserves no less, for it's interesting throughout, in some points unique." "That would cost money now?" suggested Parson Jack, pitching his voice to the true Langona sing-song. £2,000 would go a long way. The tourist scanned the wagon roof critically, and lowering his eyes, at length observed the parson's smile. "Ah, I see. A sum that would take some collecting hereabouts. Parson's none too well off, eh? £50 a year or so? Scandalous! Who's the lay impropriator?" he was told. Well, but wouldn't he help? Parson Jack shook his head. He had never asked a penny from Sir Harry Vile, who was a notorious Gallio in all that concerned religion. He had a further reason, too. He suspected that Sir Harry chafed a little in a careless way at his continuing to hold the living, and that would be glad to see him replaced by an incumbent with private means and no failings to be apologized for, with the shrug of his shoulders. Sir Harry, he knew, was aware of these hateful lapses, though too delicate to allude to them, and far too charitable to use them, unless under compulsion, as a lever for getting rid of him. And this knowledge was perhaps the worst of his shame. Yet what could he do, since to surrender Langona was to starve? "Your parson might at least make a beginning," pursued the tourist. "A box, now, inviting donations. That would cost nothing, and might relieve a visitor here and there of a spare sovereign. He could put up a second box for himself. It's quite a usual thing in churches when the parish priest is poor. You might make the suggestion, if he's not too proud." "I will," said Parson Jack. And after the tourist had gone, he thought much of these 2 boxes. Indeed, he made and fixed up the first that same week, though he labelled it for church repairs, fighting shy of restoration as too magniloquent. The second cost him long searchings of heart, and he walked over and laid the case before Parson Kendall, rector of the near parish of St. Cadix, a good Christian and a good fellow, with whom he sometimes smoked a pipe. "Why not?" answered Parson Kendall. "It's the most ordinary thing in the world." "But Sir Harry may not like it." The rector chuckled. "If he doesn't, he'll consult me, and I shall ask him why he hunts a pack by subscription." And so the second box was nailed beside the first, and excited little discussion. Indeed, the pair hung in so obscure a corner behind the font that at the very first service only Parson Jack and the widow Copping was aware of them. The parson stumbled and hesitated so badly over the prayers that 1 or 2 worshippers felt sure he had been drinking, which was not the fact. The widow Copping took no interest in collecting boxes, and besides, she could not read, so the innovation missed fire. Moreover, it suggested neither popery nor priestcraft, and only a fool would suspect Parson Flood of either. The parson's box remained, provoking no criticism. He himself had a little plan for its contents. He would spend the money on a journey to his nephews and nieces. If they were anywhere in England, he would find out. There was no hurry, he told himself with a queer smile. There was not. The box provoked neither ill criticism nor effusive charity. On Trinity Sunday, when he opened it and counted out 1 shilling in silver and 7 pence in coppers, Parson Jack pulled a wry face and then laughed aloud. Part 2. Beep, beep, beep. The postman's horn in the village street above him shook the parson out of his idleness, if not out of his dark thoughts. He sprang up, gripped his shovel, and began spading the white river sand into his sack. "It is useless, after all," said he to himself. "The crack on the south of the tower stands still, but the smaller and more dangerous one, the one on the weather side, is widening fast. This winter even may finish matters." He took up a few more shovelfuls. "Anyhow, it will not last my time. And since it will not," he paused, as a thought rose before him like a blank wall. "If the church fell, nay, when it fell, this comrade which had taken possession of his purposes, his fears, his fate, this enigmatic building of which he knew neither the history nor the founder's name, but only its wounds, Why, then his occupation was gone. He might outlive it for years, perhaps a third of his lifetime, but he had no hopes beyond. In imagination he saw it fall, and after that nothing. And he laughed, not the laugh with which he had counted out the money in his collecting box, but one of sheer self-contempt and passing bitter. The impression had been so sharp that he flung a glance up at the grey tower topping the grey-green rise, and with that was aware of the postman swinging with long strides down the slope towards him. He turned in confusion and resumed his shovelling. Why was the man coming this way, by a path out of his daily beat? Parson Jack stooped over his work. He wished to avoid greeting him. There was talk, no doubt, up at the village. But the postman was not to be denied. He stopped and hailed across the stream. "Hello, parson! I've just left a letter for you at the parsonage. A long blue letter, and important by the look of it, with a seal, a man's hand coming out of a castle. Do you know it?" "No," answered Parson Jack. "Did you come out of your way to tell me this?" "Not quite, though I'd do it as much for ye any day, out of friendliness. But tell ye the truth, I was sent to seek you with a message." "A message?" "Sir Harry has ridden over from Carwithiel, and wants you up to church. He's there waiting with his nephew, a narrow-chested slip of a chap with a square-cut collar and a popish sort of face." Parson Jack lifted his shovel and passed his palm over its blade, which the sand had already polished. "Thank you," said he. "I'll be going at once." But he made no motion to start while the postman stood eyeing him. A sudden selfish fear paralyzed him. Had Sir Harry heard? And was this the end of his patron's forbearance? No, the news could not have reached Carwithiel so quickly. He had no enemy to arise early and carry it. To no living creature were even his follies of such importance. "Don't forget your letter," the postman reminded him, moving off towards the footbridge. Parson Jack watched him as he crossed it, and until he had scaled the western slope and disappeared over its shoulder. Then, kneeling by the stream, he dipped his head and let the icy water run past his temples. When he raised it again, his plain face was glowing, for hard fare and life in the open weather kept his complexion clear and ruddy. But the hand gripping the sack on his shoulder shook as he climbed the hill. By the lich gate he found 2 saddle horses tethered, and just outside the porch stood Sir Harry Vale, a strikingly handsome man with a careless, thoroughbred look. In fact, well over 60, but apparently 10 years younger. By habit he dressed well, and was scrupulously careful of his person. By habit, too, he remained sweet of temper and kindly of speech. But beneath this mask of habit, the heart had withered a while ago to dust, and lay in the grave of his only son. "Ah, good morning, Flood!" cried Sir Harry genially. Parson Jack, reassured, felt the colour rushing into his face. "I've brought over my nephew Clem to introduce to you. He's in orders, you know. Scholar of Balliol, Fellow of All Souls, and what not. High Anglican, too. He'll be a bishop one of these days, if money doesn't make him lazy. He's inside dancing with delight in front of your chancel screen, or rather the remains of it. Church architecture is his craze just now, that and church history. Between ourselves," Sir Harry glanced over his shoulder, "he has a bee or two in his bonnet, but that's as it should be. Every lad at his age wants to eat up the world." Parson Jack could remember no such ambition. They passed into the church together. Now the surprise which awaits you in Langona Church is its chancel, which stands high above the level of the nave, and rising suddenly beneath a fine early English arch, carries the eye upward to the altar with a strange illusion of distance. Even in those days the first impression was one of rare, almost singular beauty. an impression lost in a series of small pangs as your eye rested on the ruinous details one by one. For of the great screen nothing remained but two tall uprights, surmounted by hideous knops, the addition of some local carpenter. Between the lozenge-shaped shafts of the choir arches, the worm-riddled parclose screens dripped sawdust in little heaps. Down in the nave, bench ends leaned askew or had been broken up, built as panels into deal pews, and daubed with paint. The floor was broken and ran in uneven waves, the walls shed plaster, and a monstrous gallery blocked the belfry arch. Upon this gallery Parson Jack had spent most of his careful, unsightly carpentry, for the simple reason that it had been unsafe, and for the simple reason that they had let in the rain. He had provided half a dozen windows with new panes, solid enough, but in appearance worthy only to cover cucumbers. As he entered with Sir Harry, the Reverend Clement Vial swung round upon him eagerly, but paused with just a perceptible start at sight of his unclerical garb. "Let me introduce you, Clem. This is Mr. Flood." Parson Jack bowed, and let his eyes travel around the church, which he had often enough pitied, but of which he now, for the first time, felt ashamed. "We're in a sad mess, I'm afraid," he muttered. "It is most interesting, nevertheless," Clement Vial answered. He was a thin-faced youth with a high pedagogic voice. "Better a church in this condition than one restored out of all whooping, though I read on the box yonder that you are collecting towards a restoration." Parson Jack blushed hotly. "You have made a start, eh? What are your funds in hand?" £2 4 as yet." Sir Harry laughed outright, and after a moment Parson Jack laughed too. He could not help it. But Clement Vial frowned, having no sense of humour. "I patch it up, you know, after a fashion." Parson Jack's tone was humble enough and propitiatory. Nevertheless, he glanced at his handiwork with something like pride. "The windows, for instance." The younger man turned with a shudder. "I suppose now," he said abruptly, staring up at an arch connecting the choir stalls with the southern transept, "this bit of Norman work will be as old as anything you have." That it was Norman came as news to Parson Jack. He too stared upon it, resting a palm on a crumbling bench end. "Well," said he ingeniously, "I'm no judge of these things, you know, but I always supposed the tower was the oldest bit." He broke off in confusion, not at his speech, but because Clement Vial's eyes were resting on the back of his hand, which shook with a telltale palsy. "The tower," said the young man icily, "is perpendicular, and later than 1412 at all events, when a former belfry fell in, destroyed the nave, and cracked the pavement, as you see. All this is a matter of record, as you may learn, sir, from the books, which, I feel sure, my uncle will be pleased to lend you. I need not ask, perhaps, if in the course of your excavations you have come on any traces of the original pre-Augustine oratory, or of the conventual buildings which existed here till, we are told, the middle of the 13th century." He turned away, obviously expecting no answer, addressed himself henceforward to Sir Harry, and ignored Parson Jack, who followed him abashed, yet secretly burning to hear more, and wondering where all this knowledge could be obtained. "But it is inconceivable!" Clement Vial protested to his uncle, half an hour later, as they rode back towards Carwithiel. "The man has had the cure of that parish for how long do you say? 25 years, and he has never had the curiosity to discover the most rudimentary facts in its history?" "A hard case," assented Sir Harry. "He lifts his elbow too." "Eh?" "Drinks." Sir Harry illustrated the idiom, lifting an imaginary glass to his mouth. "Oh, it's notorious. But what the deuce can we do? Kick him out? Not so easy. And besides, he'd die under a hedge. You're hard on him, Clem. He has his notions of duty. Why—" The baronet laughed. "I've seen him on the roof with a tar bucket caulking the leaks for dear life. He's a gentleman too. Clement Vial tightened his lips and rode on in silence. Left alone, Parson Jack stared around his church. His repairs, in which he had taken pride before now, seemed nakedly, hideously mean at this moment. But a new sense fought with his dejection, a sense altogether new to him, that his church had a history, a meaning into which he had never penetrated. The aisles seemed to expand, the chancel to reach up into a distance in which space and time were confused, and following it, his eye rested on a patch of colour in the east window, between the wooden tablets of the law, a cluster of fragments of stained glass, rescued by some former vicar and set amid the clear panes, the legs and scarlet robe of a saint, an angel's wing, a broken legend on a scroll, part of a coat of arms, azure with a fess, wavy of gold, all thrown together as by a kaleidoscope gone mad. Each of these scraps had once a meaning. So this church held meanings too long ignored by him, partly intelligible, yet soon to be mixed inextricably in a common downfall. For Clement Vial might be wise in the history of architecture, but his eye had not read the one plain warning which stared a common workman in the face, that the days of this building were surely numbered, and were probably few. Parson Jack had a mind to run after him. He must learn, and speedily, all about the church, its builders, this old colony of monks. But where? In books, doubtless. Where could those books be found? He had almost reached the door, when his eye fell on the two collecting boxes. With a sudden thought he paused, drew a key from the pocket of his corduroys, and unlocked his own, the parson's box. A sovereign lay within. He picked up the coin and considered it, a dark flush growing on his face. Parson Jack had a temper, though few guessed it. With an effort he controlled it now, dropped the sovereign into the box labelled Church Repairs, and walked slowly out. He had no longer a mind to run after Clement Vial. Instead he bent his steps towards the 4-room cottage which he called the parsonage, and found too large for his needs. On a sitting-room table lay a letter in a large blue envelope with a red seal. Part 3. That same day, and soon after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Parson Jack knocked at the door of St. Cadoc's rectory. The rector, a widower, usually ate his dinner in the middle of the day, and immediately afterward retired to his study with a glass of hot brandy and water, presumably to meditate. At Parson Jack's entrance he started up from his armchair with a flushed face and a somewhat incoherent greeting, in the middle of which he suddenly observed that his friend's face too was agitated. "But what brings you? Nothing wrong, I hope?" "No," answered Parson Jack dubiously. Then, "Oh, no, on the contrary. I came to ask you if you have any books bearing on this part of the world, county histories, ecclesiastical histories, and the like, especially ecclesiastical histories. I want to read up about Lagona." The rector's eyes twinkled. "This is rather sudden, eh? After 25 years?" "I suppose it is." Parson Jack blushed like a schoolboy, but he laughed nevertheless, for he held news, and it bubbled within him. "Preparing a lecture?" "No, the fact is," he straightened his face, "I've just learnt of my brother Lionel's death in India. I've never seen him since we were boys," he added apologetically. The rector paid his respect to death in a serious little cough. "Still, I don't quite understand." "He has left me £5,000. "Ah, a very tidy sum, my dear Flood. I congratulate you. With all my heart I do. You have the prospect now of many happy days." He shook his friend's hands warmly. "But excuse me, what has this to do with reading ecclesiastical history of Lagona or any other place?" "Well," Parson Jack answered shyly, sitting down and filling his pipe, "I thought of restoring the church." My dear fellow, don't be a fool, if I may speak profanely. £5,000 is a tidy sum, no doubt, in Lagona especially. But you'll be leaving Lagona. You can buy yourself a decent little living, or retire and set up comfortably as a bachelor on £250 a year, with a cob and a gig as you grow older." Parson Jack shook his head. "I've been paying debts all my life, with the help of Lagona," said he, puffing slowly, "and now I see that I owe the place repayment. But it isn't that exactly," he went on with a quickening voice and another of his shy blushes, "and I don't want you to mistake that for the real reason. The fact is, I'm attached to the place, to the church especially. It seems a silly thing to say, when I haven't troubled to learn 10 words of its history, and don't know Norman work from any but my own." He laughed grimly, biting on his pipe stem. "But that can be mended, I suppose, and the old barn has become a sort of companion, and that's about the long and the short of it." The rector leaned forward and tapped the bowl of his pipe reflectively on the fender bars. "You are the residuary legatee, I take it. Your brother was unmarried?" "Oh dear, no. Lionel was married and had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Has, I should say, for I imagine they're all alive, the widow too. I don't know where they are. The lawyers merely speak of my 5,000 as a legacy, and they say nothing of the rest of the will." "That's queer." The rector reached for his tobacco jar. You mean my not knowing the whereabouts of the family? Between ourselves, I believe there was a screw loose in Lionel's domestic affairs. I know nothing definite positively. We corresponded now and then," continued Parson Jack, "say twice a year, and of late years he dropped all mention of them, and I gathered that questions were not wanted. But the wife and children are provided for, you may depend, and there's the pension." "You're not an executor even." "No, it seems there were 2, but one died. The survivor, a Major Bromham, lives in Plymouth, retired apparently, and I suppose an old friend of Lionel's. It's through his solicitors that I had the news." "And with it the first announcement of your brother's death. It seems queer to me that this Major Bromham didn't send you a line of his own. How do the lawyers put it?" "Oh, the barest announcement. Here it is, you can read for yourself. On the instruction of our client, Major Bromham, late 16th Bengal Lancers, we have to inform you of the death by syncope at Calcutta on the 5th of July last of your brother Lionel Flood, Esquire, late of the Indian Civil Service, Assistant Commissioner, and also that by the terms of his will, executed so and so, of which our client is the surviving executor, etc. All precious formal and cold-blooded. No doubt his death was telegraphed home to the newspapers, and they take it for granted that I heard or read of it." "Perhaps." The rector rose. "Shall we have a stroll through the stables? Afterwards you shall have a book or 2 to carry off." "But look here, Kendall, I came to you as a friend, you know. It seems to me all plain sailing enough, but you seem to imply—" "Do I? Then I am doubtless an ass. You think this Major Bromham should have written to me direct? I see that you do. Well, he lives no farther away than Plymouth. I might run up and call on him. Why, to be sure—" Parson Jack's brow cleared. "And he can give me the address of the wife and children." End of section 14. Section 15 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Parson Jack's Fortune, Part 4. Parson Jack walked home with a volume of Gilbert's Survey and another of the Parochial History of Cornwall under his arm, and Parker's Glossary in his skirt pocket. He began that evening with the Parochial History article Langona, and smoked his pipe over it until midnight in a sort of rapture it would be hard to analyze. In fact, no doubt it was made up of that childish delight which most men feel on reading in print what they know perfectly well already. The eastern end of the north aisle is used as a vestry, and the eastern end of the south aisle is impropriated to the church warden's use. Yes, that was right. And the inscription on the one marble tablet was correctly given, and the legend over the south porch, Ego sum Janua per me qui intrabit servabitur. But the delight of recognition was mixed with that of discovery. The lower part of the tower was early English, the upper perpendicular. A pause here, and a reference to Parker. The nave, too, perpendicular. Ah, then, it could only have been the upper part, the belfry, which fell in and destroyed the nave. What was the date? 1412. And they both had been rebuilt together on the call of Edmund Stafford, Bishop of Exeter, in the August of that year. He read on, the familiar at each step opening new bypaths into the unguessed. But the delight of delights was to hug, while he read, his purpose to change all this story of ruin, to give it a new and happier chapter, to stand out eminent among the forgotten vicars of Langona. The book slid from his knee to the floor with a crash. He picked it up carefully, turned down the lamp, laughed to himself, and went off to bed shivering but happy. He awoke to fresh daydreams. Daydreams filled the next week with visions of the church in all its destined beauty. To be sure, they were extravagant enough. Fantasies in which flying buttresses and flamboyant traceries waltzed around solid Norman and rigid perpendicular. Nightmares of undigested Parker. But they kept Parson Jack happy. He had not forgotten to answer Messrs. Cudmore's letter, thanking them for their information, and adding that he proposed to pay a visit to Plymouth, and would call upon Major Bromham with that gentleman's leave, and discuss the legacy. They replied that their client was just then in the north of Devon on a shooting party, but would return to Plymouth by an afternoon train on the following Wednesday, and grant Mr. Flood an interview. The tone of this letter, as of the previous one, was unmistakably cold, but Parson Jack read nothing more in it than professional formality. On the Wednesday, however, when he reached Plymouth, he presented himself at Messrs. Cudmore's office, and was admitted to see the head of the firm. The manner of his reception began to puzzle him. "Mr. Flood," began Mr. Cudmore senior, with the faintest possible bow, "our client, Major Bromham, is not returning until late this afternoon by the 4:40 train. In fact, I myself dictated the letter in reply to yours, and fancied I had made it explicit." "Oh, quite. I called merely in the hope that you would give me some further information about my brother's will, since apart from this legacy I know nothing." "You must excuse me, but I prefer to leave that to the Major. In any case, the will is to be proved without delay, and may then, as you know, be inspected for a shilling." Parson Jack, guileless man that he was, had a way of putting a straight question. "I want to know," said he quietly, "why on earth you are treating me like this." "My dear sir," began the lawyer, but Parson Jack cut him short. "I, for my part, will be plain with you. I asked to see the will simply because I know nothing of my brother's property, and wish to see how his wife and children are provided for. There is nothing extraordinary in that, surely." The lawyer pondered, eyeing him. Clearly there was something in this shabbily dressed clergyman which countered his expectations. "The person who could best satisfy you on this point would be Mrs. Flood herself. But I take it you have no desire to see her personally?" Mrs. Flood? You mean my brother's wife? Certainly. But is she here in Plymouth? Parson Jack's eyes opened wide. I presume so. Hoe Terrace, she informs me, has been her address for these 8 years. But of course you are aware. Aware, sir, I am aware of nothing. Least of all am I aware of any reason why I should not call upon her. Hoe Terrace, did you say? What number? 34. You will bear in mind that I have not advised. Oh, dear me, no, you have advised nothing. Good morning, Mr. Cudmore. And Parson Jack, fuming, found himself in the street. He filled and lit his pipe to soothe his humour, but he forgot that the clergy of Plymouth do not as a rule smoke clay pipes in the public streets, and the attention he excited puzzled and angered him yet further. He set it down to his threadbare coat and rustic boots. It was in no sweet mood that he strode up Hoe Terrace, eyeing the numbers above the doors, and halted at length to knock out his pipe before a house with an unpainted area railing, to which a small boy in ragged knickerbockers was engaged in attaching with a string the tail of a protesting puppy. "I shouldn't do that if I were you," said Parson Jack, rapping the bowl of his pipe against his boot heel. "I don't suppose you would," retorted the small boy. "But then there's some parsons wouldn't smoke a clay." Before Parson Jack could discover a repartee, the door opened and a young man with a weak chin and bright yellow boots came out laughing, followed by a good-looking girl, who turned on the step to close the door behind her. Although in black, she was outrageously overdressed. An enormous black feather nodded above her picture hat, and with one hand she held up her skirt, revealing a white embroidered petticoat deplorably stained with mud. In the act of turning, she caught sight of the small boy, and at once began to rate him. "Haven't I told you 50 times to let that dog alone? Go indoors this instant and get yourself cleaned. For my part, I don't know what Tillotson means, letting you out of school so early." "I haven't been to school," the boy announced, catching at a dirty sheet of newspaper which fluttered against the railing, and nonchalantly folding it into a cocked hat. "Your mumps have been all right for a week. There's not the slightest risk of infection, and you know it. You don't tell me you've persuaded mother—" "I haven't said a word to her," the boy interrupted. "It isn't mumps, it's these breeches. If you can't find time to darn 'em, I'm not going to school till somebody can." The young man tittered, and the girl, with a toss of her head and a glance at Parson Jack, who was pretending to tie his bootlace, accepted defeat. "Where did you pick up that puppy?" asked Parson Jack, after watching the pair up the street. "What's that to you?" "Nothing at all, only I'm a judge of wire-haired terriers, and he has a touch of breed somewhere." "Well, if you won't answer that question, I'll try you with another. Is that Gertrude or Ada?" He nodded up the street. "That's Ada. Gertrude is indoors trimming a hat. You seem to know a heap about us." "Not much, but I'm going to call and find out more if I can. You're Richard, I suppose?" "Dick, for short. Ring the bell if you like, and I'll run around and open the door. Only don't say I didn't warn you." This sounded like an absurd echo of the lawyer, and set Parson Jack smiling. "We don't subscribe to anything or take any truck in parsons, and the slavey has a whitlow on her finger, and mother's having fits over the cooking. But come in if you want to." "Thank you, I will." While Parson Jack ascended to the front door and rang at the bell, Dick skipped down the area steps and presently opened to him with a mock start of surprise. "Beg your pardon," said he, "but I took you for the rates or the broker's man." He winked as he ushered in the visitor. The running click of a sewing machine sounded above stairs, and up from the basement floated an aroma of fried onions and filled the passage. "First turning to the right," admonished the boy, and stepping past him to the head of the basement stairs, called down, "Mother! I say, Mother! Here's a gentleman to see you." "Then," came the answer, "tell Gertie to step down and find out what he wants. I'm busy." Parson Jack discreetly shut the door and fell to studying the not over clean drawing room, which was tricked out with muslin draperies, cheap Japanese fans, photographs, mostly of officers in the uniform of the Royal Marines, and such artistic trifles as painted tambourines, sabots, drain pipes, and milking stools. In one wicker chair, the wicker daubed with royal red enamel, lay a banjo. In another was curled a sleeping terrier, indubitably the mother of the puppy outside. Near the door stood a piano with a comic opera score on the music rest, open at number 12, I'm a cheery Fusilieri, oh! And on its rosewood top an ashtray full of cigarette ends, and a shaded lamp the base of which needed wiping. The terrier awoke, yawned, and was waddling down from its couch to make friends when Master Dick returned. "Mother wants to know who you are, and what's your business. Gertie wouldn't come down when she heard you weren't Jack Phillips." "Then tell your mother that I am your uncle, John Flood. That will satisfy her, perhaps." "You!" Dick took him in from top to toe in a long, incredulous stare, but turned and went without another word. It may have been 5 minutes before the door opened and Mrs. Flood entered, with an air nicely balanced between curiosity, hauteur, and injured innocence. A shabby, genteel woman in a widow's cap and a black cashmere gown, which had been too near the frying pan. "Good morning." Mrs. Flood bowed stiffly, not to say stonily, folded her wrists accurately in front of her over her waistband, and waited. "I am John Flood, you know, poor Lionel's brother. I have just come from Cudmore and Cudmore's, the solicitors, to talk with you, if I may, about this will. It seems that I have a legacy, but beyond this I know nothing, and indeed until Messrs. Cudmore wrote I wasn't even aware of an illness." Mrs. Flood's eyes seemed to answer, if such a thing could be said in a ladylike way, that he might tell that to the Marines. But without relenting their hostility, she took occasion to mop them. "It was a cruel will," she murmured. "My husband and I had differences. In fact, we have lived apart for many years. Still," she broke off, "you know, of course, that he went wrong, took to living with natives and adopted their horrible ways. In the end, I believe he turned Hindu." "God bless my soul, but he used to write regularly, up to the end." "No doubt." The two words were full of spiteful meaning, though what that meaning was, Parson Jack could not guess. His letters gave no hint of this. Again Mrs. Flood's bitter smile gave him, politely, the lie. "He drank, too," she went on after a cold pause. "I had always supposed it was the one thing those natives didn't do. We thought of contesting the will on the ground of undue influence and his mind being gone." "Did Lionel leave them much, then?" "Them?" she queried. "His friends over there, the natives." "He left nothing but this legacy of £5,000 and the residue in equal shares to his poor family." Here her handkerchief came into play again. "Only, as it turns out, there isn't any residue, scarcely a penny more when all is realized, except the pension, of course." Unmasking her batteries with sudden spite, she added, "Even between you, I couldn't be robbed of that." Parson Jack controlled himself. He was genuinely sorry for the woman, but either cheek showed a red spot, and his voice shook a little as he answered, "This is a trifle gratuitous, then, your talk about undue influence." "The proof of the pudding is in the eating," replied Mrs. Flood, with a small and vicious titter, not because she believed him to be guilty, or that it would do any good, but simply because her instinct told her it would hurt. "That seems to close the discussion." Parson Jack bowed with honest, if clumsy, dignity. "I am sorry, madam, for what you have told me, but my regrets had better be expressed to Major Bromham." "Regrets, indeed," sniffed Mrs. Flood. And these were the last words he ever heard from her. A minute later he found himself in the street, walking towards the Hoe, and drawing deep breaths as his lungs felt the sea breeze. He had not the least notion of his direction. But as he went, he muttered to himself, and for a parson's his words sounded deplorably like swearing. "Hi, hi!" called a shrill voice behind him. He swung right about and found himself frowning down upon Master Dick. "How did you like it?" inquired that youngster, panting. "She's a caution, the mater, but it wasn't a patch on what I've heard her promise to give you if ever she sets eyes on you." "Indeed? How do you know, pray?" "Why, I listened at the door, of course," was the unabashed reply. "But I don't believe a word of it, you know," he added reassuringly. "A word of what?" "That rot about undue influence." "I thank you. Did you follow me to tell me this?" "Well, I dunno." "Yes, I guess I did. You're a good man. I saw that at once, though you do smoke a clay pipe." "Thank you again for the reminder." Parson Jack pulled out his clay and filled it. "So I'm a good man." Dick nodded. "I'm not saying anything about the legacy. That's hard lines on us, of course, but I believe you. There's no chance of my being a gentleman now, like you. But," with a wry grin, "I'm not the sort of chap to bear malice." They had walked on through the gate leading to the Hoe, and were in full view now of the splendid panorama of the Sound. "And why shouldn't you be a gentleman?" asked Parson Jack, halting and cocking down an eye upon this queer urchin. "Well, there's a goodish bit against it, you'll allow. You saw what we're like at home." He looked up at Parson Jack frankly enough, but into his speech there crept a strange embarrassment, too old for his years. "I mean, you saw enough without my telling you, and I mustn't give the show away." "No, to be sure," assented Parson Jack. "Dick, you've the makings of a good fellow," he added musingly. But the boy's eyes had wandered to the broad sheet of water below. "Crikey, there she goes!" he cried, and jerked his arm towards an unwieldy battleship nosing her way out of the Hamows, her low bows tracing a thin line of white. For half a minute they stood watching her. "She's ugly enough, in all conscience," commented Parson Jack. "She's a holy terror, but perhaps you don't believe in turrets, nor do I to that extent. It's tempting Providence." "In what way?" "Top hamper," said Dick shortly, "but she's a terror all the same." "What's her name, I wonder?" "Sakes, you don't say you don't know the old Devastation? Why, it's 15 years or so since they launched her at Portsmouth, and I hear tell she'll have to be reconstructed, though even then I guess they won't trust her far at sea. She has no speed either, for these days, she's a holy fraud." And Master Dick poured in a broadside of expert criticism as the monster felt her way and slowly headed around the winter buoy into the Smeaton Pass. "Nevertheless, you wouldn't object to be on board of her?" "Don't." The boy's eyes had filled on a sudden. "You mayn't mean it, but it hurts." 4 hours later, in the early dusk, Parson Jack stepped into the street after shaking hands with Major Bromham at the door. What is more, the Major stood bareheaded in the doorway for some moments and stared after him. Dick had echoed Lawyer Cudmore once more that day. It was now the Major's turn to echo Dick. "That's a good man," he muttered to himself. Curiously like his brother, too, in the days before he went wrong. But Lionel Flood has a soft streak in him, and India found it out. This parson seems tougher, result of hard work and plain living, no doubt. His musings at this point grew involved, and he frowned. Says he knew nothing of Lionel's affairs, offers to show me all the letters to prove it, but this behaviour of his is proof enough. Deuced handsome behaviour, too. I wonder if he can afford it. Gad, what a pack of falsehoods that woman has poured into me. She always had a gift of circumstantial lying. I believe if Lionel had kept a tight rein on her and shown her the whip now and then. But what's the use of speculating? Anyway, it's rough on the parson, and if I hadn't to consider Dick and the girls—" Dusk had given way to gaslight, and Parson Jack still paced the streets, intending but still deferring to find a dinner and a night's lodging. He had shaken hands with Major Bromham in a mood of curious exaltation. He had decided almost without a struggle. To his mind the question was a clear one of right and wrong, and no argument helped it. Still, a man did not renounce £5,000 every day of his life, and when he does, has some right to pat his conscience on the back. He derived some pleasure, too, from picturing the pretty gratitude with which his beneficiaries would hear Major Bromham's message. He did not know Mrs. Flood. But his church! He had forgotten it, or almost forgotten, and the recollection came upon him like a blow. He halted beneath a gas lamp in dismay, not in resentment at the shattering of his dream, for he scarcely thought of himself, not in doubt, for he had done rightly, and his church could not be restored at the expense of right, but in sheer dismay before the blank certainty that now his church must fall. Nothing could save it. He must go home to it, live with it, watch it to the inevitable end. He put out a hand against an iron pillar, and of a sudden felt faint, almost sick. And as a matter of fact, he had eaten nothing since his early breakfast. A few doors down the street the bright lamp of a tavern, the Sword and Flag, caught his eye. He tottered in and asked for a glass of brandy. It did him good, and he called for another. Some soldiers entering with a girl or two, and finding a clergyman seated with his glass in this not over reputable den, began to chaff. He answered gently and good-naturedly, but with a slight stutter, enough to hint at fun ahead, and they improved upon the hint. By 9 o'clock Parson Jack was silly drunk. At 11, when the premises were closed, the police found him speechless, and the rest of the night he spent in the borough lock-up. Part 5. It appeared in the newspapers, of course. Deplorable story. A clergyman fined for drunkenness. Well, this was more than even Sir Harry could stand. "I'm sorry for you, Flood," said he, when 3 days later Parson Jack appeared at Carwithiel to resign his living. "But you've taken the only proper course. Otherwise you'd have driven us to an inquiry, sequestration, no end of a scandal. I've had to keep my eyes shut once or twice in the past, as you probably guess." "You have shown me all the kindness you could," answered Parson Jack. "I won't disgust you with thanks, and there are no excuses." He picked up his hat and turned to go. "Well, look here, don't be in a hurry. What about your prospects? They're none too healthy, I'm afraid. Still, if a few pounds could give you a fresh start somewhere—" "I have no prospects, but for the moment I wasn't thinking of myself. I was thinking of Langona and the old church." "Oh, the church is all right. Clem, my nephew, has a fad in his head. He asked me yesterday for the living, in case you resigned. I tell him it's folly. A youngster oughtn't to play with his chances. But he insists that it will do him good to fling up Oxford and play parish priest for a year or two. He's taken a fancy to your church and wants to restore it. He can pay for his whims. The money's all in his branch of the family." "Restore it? The church restored?" Sir Harry looked up sharply, for the words came in a whisper of awe, almost of terror, and looking up he saw Parson Jack's eyes dilated, as a man who stares on a vision. But while they stared, there grew in them a slow beatific surmise. "The Lord taketh away," said Parson Jack. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." 6 weeks later, the Reverend Clement Viele was inducted into the living of Langona. vacant by the resignation of the Reverend John Flood. His first sermon announced that the church was to be restored without delay, that plans were even now being prepared by an eminent architect, and that as soon as they arrived and were approved, tenders would be invited. Mr. Weir was in no hurry to take possession of the parsonage. Indeed, bachelor though he was and professed ascetic, he decided that to be habitable it needed a wing and a new kitchen at the back. For the present he accepted his uncle's invitation to use the hospitality and the library of Carwithiel. Parson Jack might give up possession at his own convenience. Nevertheless, he gave it up at once, packed his few belongings, and hired a bedroom at the widow Copping's. It appeared that he, too, needed time to look about him. And so he loitered about Langona until the architect's plans were received, discussed, approved, and submitted to tender. A Bristol builder secured the contract. The day after it was signed, Parson Jack walked over to Carwithiel again, and asked leave to speak with Mr. Weir. He wore his old working suit. "I have come to ask a favour, sir," said he, speaking humbly. "I hear that the contract for the church has been given to Miles and Company, of Bristol, and I would take it kindly if you recommended me to them as a workman." The new vicar was taken by surprise, and showed it. "I have picked up some knowledge of the work in these years," Parson Jack explained timidly, "and I know the weak points in the old fabric better than most men. As for steadiness," he wound up, "I only ask to be given a trial. You must discharge me the first time I give cause of complaint." What on earth could I say to the man? Mr. Weir demanded that evening, when he discussed the application with his uncle. "I hope you accepted," said Sir Harry sharply. "Yes, though I fear it was imprudent." "Fiddlestick! Speak a word for him to Miles. He won't find a better workman." And so Parson Jack stayed at Langona, and beheld his best dream take shape, though not at his command, and yet in part by his fashioning. Nay, even some measure of that personal pride for which he had once bargained was restored to him during the second year, on the day when the contractor, who shared the common knowledge of his past, but respected his unequalled knowledge of the old fabric and its weakness, his gentle ardour in learning, and his mild authority among the men, appointed him clerk of the works. In those days Parson Jack needed no man's pity, for all day long he redeemed a debt, and wrought into substance an ambition that yet grew purer, as few ambitions do, in taking substance. And with it he wove another dream, which in the intervals of labour would draw him out of the churchyard, and hold him at gaze there, with his eyes on the wedge of blue sea beyond the coombe. From the hour of his fall no strong drink passed his lips. His was an almost desperate case, but he fought with two strong allies. It was as though the old church, rallying under his eyes for a new lease of life, put new blood into him, repaying his love. Also, he had Dick's letters. "Upon my word," said Sir Harry to his nephew, "I've a mind to put Flood into the living again when this business is over and you tire of your whim. I suppose there's nothing to prevent it?" There was nothing to prevent it, but as a reward it lay outside Parson Jack's speculation, perhaps beyond his desire. His reward came to him on the afternoon when, having mounted a ladder beside the new east window, he looked over his shoulder and saw Parson Kendall entering the churchyard by the lych gate, and ushering in a youngster, a mere boy still, but splendid in the uniform of a freshly blown naval cadet. Parson Jack can scarcely be said to have risen to the occasion. "Hullo, Dick," he said, descending the ladder and holding out his hand. But the rector, standing aside, made a better speech, though this too was short enough. God fulfills himself in many ways, said the rector to himself. End of section 15.
Section 16 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Quiller-Couch. Section 16. The Burglary Club. Yes, said the judge, I ought by this time to know something of Cornish juries. They acquit oftener than other juries, to be sure, and the general notion is that they incline more towards mercy. Privately, I believe that mercy has very little to do with it. Stupidity, said the High Sheriff sententiously, and sipped his wine. His own obtuseness on the bench was notorious, and had kept adding for 30 years to the Duchy's stock of harmless merriment. Nothing of the sort, snapped his lordship. You can convict a man, I presume, as stupidly as you can acquit him. No, with other juries a crime is a crime, and a misdemeanour is a misdemeanour. You tell them so, and they accept it. But with Cornishmen you have first to explain that the alleged offence is illegal. Next you must satisfy them that it ought to be illegal, and then, if you choose, you can proceed to prove that the prisoner committed it. They will finally discharge him on the ground that he never had the advantage of such a clear exposition of the law as they have just enjoyed. Well, but isn't that stupidity? Persisted the High Sheriff. The judge turned impatiently and addressed a grey-headed man on his left. Did I ever tell you, Mr. Blank, how I once enjoyed the hospitality of a Cornish village through the simple accident of being mistaken for a burglar? The grey-headed man, an eminent Q.C. and leader of the Western Circuit, dropped an olive into his glass of sherry. He had been dozing. 2 or 3 guests and members of the junior bar drew their chairs closer. It was in 1845, the judge began, just after I had taken my degree, and I had been walking through Cornwall with a knapsack. No small adventure, I can tell you, in those days. The inhabitants declined to believe that any one could walk and carry a pack for the fun of the thing, and I left a trail of suspicion behind me. The folks were invariably hospitable, though convinced that I was pursuing no good. You remember, Mr. Blank, that when Telemachus visited Gerenia, he was generously entertained, and afterwards politely asked if he happened to be a pirate. My case was pretty similar, only my Cornish hosts did not ask, but took it for granted. In the first week of August, to be precise on the 4th, I reached Polreen Cove, and found lodging at the small inn. The spot and the people so pleased me that I engaged my rooms for a week. At the week's end I had decided to stay for a month. I stayed for almost 2 months. Well, as luck would have it, I had not been in Polreen 3 nights before there happened the first burglary within the memory of its oldest inhabitant. If burglary it was, I incline to think that Mrs. Giddy, the general dealer, had left her shop door unbolted, and that the culprit, after removing the bell (the door had 2 flaps, and the bell hung on a half coil of metal, was fitted to a socket inside the lower flap), had quietly walked in and made his choice. This choice was a peculiar one. 6 bars of yellow soap, a colander, some tallow candles, a pair of alpaca boots, a pair of braces, several boxes of matches, an uncertain amount of cheese, a dozen pocket handkerchiefs, a coloured almanac, 3 of Mrs. Giddy's brass weights, and the bell. He was detected 2 months later at Bristol in the act of using one of the handkerchiefs, which illustrated the descent of Moses from Mount Sinai, and 4 other handkerchiefs were found in his possession, together with Mrs. Giddy's brass weights. He had disposed of the rest of the booty, and proved to be a stowaway who had been turned out of a Cardiff schooner on Penzance Quay, penniless and starving. Nothing further was proved against him, and it still puzzles me how he made his way through the length of Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset on the not very nutritious spoils of Mrs. Giddy's shop. For the moment he got clear away. Not a soul in Polreen had set eyes on him, and as he entered the village by night, so he departed. I know now that the excitement in the cove was intense, that for weeks afterwards the women carried their silver teaspoons and chinaware to bed with them, and I should explain that the housewives of Polreen are inordinately proud of their teaspoons and chinaware, heirlooms which mark the only degrees of social importance recognised among the inhabitants of that happy cove. A family there counts its teaspoons as our old nobility counted its quarterings. A girl is judged to have made a good, bad, or indifferent match by the number of teaspoons she marries into, and the extreme act of disinheritance is symbolised not by the testamentary shilling, nor by erasing a name from the family Bible, but by alienating the family plate basket. In short, teaspoons are to the Covers what the salt cellar was to the ancient Latin races. But at the time, though I could not help observing symptoms of suppressed excitement, the Cove behaved with an outward calm which struck me as highly creditable. To be sure, the men seemed to spend an extravagant amount of their time in the tap room of the inn, which happened to be immediately beneath my sitting room. Hour after hour the sound of their muffled conversation ascended to me through the planching, as I sat and studied Dumas, I think. Low, monotonous, untiring, it lasted from breakfast time until 9 o'clock at night, when it ceased abruptly, the company dispersed, and each man went home to reassure and protect his wife. I suppose some liquor was required to start this conversation and keep it going, just as seamen use a bucketful of water to start a ship's pump. But I must admit that during my whole stay at Polreen I never saw an inhabitant who could be described as the worse for drink. I did not know that this assemblage in the tap room was unusual and clean contrary to the men's habits, and therefore may be excused for not guessing its significance. Nor was I familiar enough with Polreen to note an even more frequent change in the atmosphere and routine of its daily life. When the weather is fine down there, the men put out to sea and the women go about their work with smiles. When it blows, the women go about their work, but resignedly and in a temper, which the men avoid by ranging up shoulder to shoulder along the wall by the lifeboat house, and gazing with approval at the weather. With approval because it relieves them of the fatigue of argument. But should the day break doubtfully, and the men incline to give themselves the benefit of the doubt, then indeed you will learn who are masters of the cove. For in extreme cases the women will even invade the rendezvous, and shrill is the noise of battle, until the weather declares unmistakably for one side or the other. Does it refuse to declare itself? Then I can promise you that half an hour will see the men routed and straggling down the beach to their boats, arching their backs and ducking their heads, maybe, under the parting volley. But, as I say, I did not know Polreen and its ways. It awoke no wonder in me to see the bulk of its male population ranged like statues, day after day, and from dawn till eve, against the wall by the lifeboat house, talking little, or ceasing at any rate to talk when I approached, smoking much, conning a serene sky and the dimples spread on the sea by a gentle nor'westerly breeze. At intervals one or two would leisurely fall out of the line and saunter towards the inn, leaving their places to others as leisurely sauntering from the inn. It did indeed occur to me to wonder how they earned their living, for during the first fortnight, beyond the occasional hauling of a crab pot, I saw no evidence at all of labour. It was on the tip of my tongue once or twice to question them, but, though polite, they clearly had no wish to be communicative. I found great difficulty in hiring a boat and the services of its owner. I wished to be rowed along the coast, to try for pollock, to inspect some of Polreen's famous caves. The men were polite again, but one boat leaked badly, another had been pulled up for the carpenter to insert a new strake, a third was too heavy, the owner of a fourth could not leave his business, it wouldn't pay him. At length I patched up a bargain with an old fisherman named Oodie, or rather Old Tom Oodie, to distinguish him from his son, who was Young Tom. He owned the most ramshackle old boat in the cove. If the others were out of repair, his was manifestly beyond it. I took my life in my hands and struck the bargain. "When do you want her?" "Now, at once," said I, "or as soon as you have had your dinner." He went back to the company by the lifeboat house. He reminded me of some ancient king consulting a company of stone gods. They looked at him, and he looked at them. I suppose a word or two was said. Half a dozen of them spat reflectively. Nobody moved. Old Tom Udy came down the beach again. We embarked and pushed off, and the row of expressionless faces watched us from the shore. In silence we visited the famous caverns. As we emerged from the last of these, I essayed some casual talk. To tell the truth, I was beginning to feel the want of it, and of course I began on the first topic of local interest, the burglary. "The odd thing to me," said I, "is that you seem to have no particular suspicions." "I'd rather you didn't talk of it," said old Tom Udy. "I got my living to get, and 'tis a day's journey to Bodmin. Though you mustn't think," he added, "that we bear any grudge." "It seems to me that you men in the Cove treat the whole affair very lightly." "Yes, that's of it," he assented. "Mind you, 'tisn't right. Seemin' to me 'tis a terrible thought. Here you be, for the sake of argument, a Christian man, and in beauty next door to the angels, and the only use you make of it is to steal groceries. You don't think I'm putting it too strong?" "Not a bit." "Well, I'm glad of that, because, since you ask me, as a professin' Christian, I couldn't say any less. But you mustn't think we bear any grudge." "I'm sure I wonder you don't. And the police still have no clue?" "The police? You mean Sammy Craigo, the constable? Why, I've knawed en from a boy. Pretty thing if any person in Polreen listened to he. No, as hasn't failed so low yet as to mind anything the constable says." "Then the whole affair is as much a mystery as ever?" "Now, look'ee here, I don't want to tell nothing more about it. A still tongue makes a wise head, and there's a pollock on the end of your line." The wind struck in the north west, and day after day the regal summer weather continued. I grew tired of hauling in pollock, and determined to have a try for the more exciting conger. The fun of this, as you know, does not begin till nightfall, and it was 7 o'clock in the evening or thereabouts when we pushed off from the beach. By 8 we had reached the best grounds, and begun operations. An hour passed, or a little more, and then old Tom Udy asked when I thought of returning. "Why, bless the man," said I, "we've not had a bite yet." He glanced at me furtively while he lit a pipe. "I reckoned maybe you might have business ashore, so to speak." "What earthly business should I have in Polreen at this hour?" "Oh, well, you know best. No affair of mine. 'Tis a dark night, too." "All the better for conger, eh?" "So 'tis." He seemed about to say more, but at that moment I felt a long pull on the line, and for an hour or two the conger kept us busy. It must have been a week later, at least, for the moon was drawing to the full, that I pulled up the blind of my sitting room a little before midnight, and ravished by the beauty of the scene, for I tell you Polreen can be beautiful by moonlight, determined to stroll down to the beach, and smoke my last pipe there before going to bed. The door of the inn was locked, no doubt, but, the house standing on the steep slope of the main street, I could step easily on to the edge of the water barrel beneath my window, and lower myself to the ground. I did so. Just as I touched solid earth, I heard footsteps. They paused suddenly, and, glancing up the moonlit road, I descried the gigantic figure of Wesley Truscott, the coxswain of the lifeboat. He must have seen me, for the light on the whitewashed front of the inn was almost as brilliant as day. But whatever his business, he had no wish to meet me, for he dodged aside into the shadow of a porch, and after a few seconds I heard him tiptoeing up the hill again. I began to have my doubts about Polreen's primitive virtues. Certainly the village, as it lay bathed in moonlight, its whitewashed terraces and glimmering roofs embowered in dark clusters of fuchsia and tamarisk, seemed to harbour nothing but peace and sleeping innocence. An ebbing tide lapped the pebbles on the beach, each pebble distinct and glistening as the water left it. Far in the quiet offing the lights of a fishing fleet twinkled like a line of jewels through the haze. Half-way down the beach I turned for a backward look at the village. Now the wall by the lifeboat house looks on the cove. Its front is turned from the village and the village street, and can only be seen from the beach. You may imagine my surprise, then, as I turned and found myself face to face with a dozen tall men, standing there upright and silent. "Good heavens!" I cried. "What is the matter? What brings you all here at this time of night?" If I was surprised, they were obviously embarrassed. They drew together a little, as if to avoid observation. But the moon shone full on the wall, affording them not a scrap of shadow. For a moment no one answered. Then I heard mutterings, and, as I stepped up, one of the elder men, Archelaus Warren by name, was pushed forward. "We wasn't expecting of you down here," he stammered, after clearing his throat. "No reason why you should," said I. "We done our best to keep out of your way, never thinking you'd be after the boats." He nodded towards the boats drawn up on the beach at our feet. "I'm afraid I don't understand you in the least." "Well, you see, 'tis a kind of club." "Indeed?" said I, not in the least enlightened. "Iss." He turned to his companions. "I suppose I'd better tell 'en." They nodded gravely, and he resumed. "You see, 'tis this way. Ever since that burglary there's no resting for the women. My poor back is blue all over with the clomb my missus takes to bed, and half a dozen times a night 'tis, 'Archelaus, I'm sartin I hear some person moving. Archelaus, fit and take a light and have a look downstairs, that's a dear.' And these fellows'll tell 'ee 'tis ever bit so bad with they. 'Tis right enough in the daytime, so long as the women got us ithin hail, but by night there's no peace nor rest." One or two husbands corroborated. "Well now, I think 'twas the third night after this affair happened, I crept downstairs for the fifth time or so just to ease the old woman's mind, and opens the door, when what do I see but Billy Polkinghorne here, sitting on his own doorstep, like a lost dog. 'Oh,' says I, 'so thee'rt feeling o't too?' 'Feeling o't,' says he, 'durned if this isn't the only place I can get a wink of sleep.' 'Come stway along to Wall End and tetch a pipe,' says I. Tha's how it began. And now, ever since Billy thought 'pon the plan of setting someone, turn and turn, to watch your window, there's nothing to hurry us. Why, only just as you came along, Billy was saying, 'Burglary,' he says. Why, I hadn't been so happy in mind since the Indian Queen came ashore." "Watch my window? Why, the—" And then, as light broke on me, "Look here," I said, "you don't mean to tell me you've been suspecting me of the burglary all this time?" "You mustn't think," said Archelaus Warren, "that we bear any grudge." "Well," the judge concluded, "as I told you, the thief was apprehended a week or two later, and my innocence established. But oddly enough, some 30 years after I had to try a case at the assizes here, in which Archelaus Warren, very old and infirm, appeared as a witness, I recognised him at once, and when I sent for him afterwards and inquired after my friends at Polreen, his first words were, 'There now, I wasn't so far wrong after all. I knowed you must be mixed up with these things, one way or another.'" End of section 16. The Burglary Club.
Section 17 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Concerning St. John of Jerusalem. Let those who know my affection for Troy consider what my feelings were the other day, when on my return from a brief jaunt to London, I alighted at the railway station amid all the tokens of a severe and general catastrophe. The porter who opened the door for me had a bandaged head. George, the bus driver, carried his right arm in a sling, but professed himself able to guide his vehicle through our tortuous streets left-handed. I had declined the offer, and was putting some sympathetic question, when a procession came by. 4 children of serious demeanour conveyed a groaning comrade on a stretcher, while a couple more limped after in approved splints. I stopped them, of course. The rearmost sufferer, who wore on his shin bone a wicker trellis of the sort used for covering flower plots, and a tourniquet contrived with a pebble and a handkerchief about his femoral artery, informed me that it was a case of first aid to the injured, which he was rendering at some risk to his own compound fracture. "It's wonderful," said George with a grin, "what crazes the youngsters will pick up." Thereupon the truth came out. It appeared that during my absence a member of the Ambulance Association of St. John of Jerusalem had descended upon the town with a course of lectures, and the town had taken up the novelty with its usual spirit. I said a course of lectures, but in Troy we are nothing if not thoroughgoing, and by this time, so George informed me, 3 courses were in full swing. The railway servants and jettymen, our instructor's earliest pupils, had arrived at restoring animation to the apparently drowned, while a mixed class, drawn from the townsfolk generally, were learning to bandage, and the members of our Young Women's Christian Association had attended but 2 lectures and still dallied with the wonders of the human frame. George told me all about it on our way through the town, for I had consented to be driven on condition that he removed his arm from the sling, and he could not deny this to an old friend, as I make free to call myself. Besides, he was bursting to talk. To be sure, he slipped it back for a few moments as we breasted the hill beyond the post office, and his horses dropped to a walk. I fancy that he glanced at me apologetically, but since there was comparatively little danger hereabouts, I thought it more delicate to look the other way. "And the Chamber of Commerce has not protested?" I asked. "We call it the Chamber of Commerce for euphony's sake. It is, in fact, an association which keeps an eye upon the Parish Council, Harbour Board, and Great Western Railway, and incites these bodies to make our town more attractive to visitors. It consists mainly of lodging-house keepers, and has this summer prevailed on the railway company to issue cheap Saturday market tickets to Plymouth, a boon which the visitor will soon learn, if we may take our own experience as a test, to rank high among the minor comforts of life." No, the Chamber of Commerce had not protested, and yet it occurred to me more than once during the next few days that strangers attracted to Troy by its reputation as a health resort must have marvelled as they walked our streets, where cases of sunstroke, frostbite, snakebite, and incipient croup challenged their pity at every corner. The very babies took their first steps in splints, and when they tumbled were examined by their older playmates, and pronounced to be suffering from apoplexy or alcoholic poisoning, as fancy happened to suggest. I believe that a single instruction in the association's handbook, carefully italicized there, I must admit, alone saved our rising generation. It ran, "Unless perfectly sure that the patient is intoxicated, do not give the emetic." To be sure, we left these extravagances to the children, but childhood, after all, is a relative term, and in Troy we pass through it to sober age by nice gradations, which take time. Already a foreign sailor, who had committed the double imprudence of drinking heavily at the Crown and Anchor, and falling asleep afterwards on the foreshore while waiting for his boat, was complaining vigorously through his vice-consul of the varieties of treatment practised upon his insensible body, and only the difficulty of tracing 5 smart bandages in a town where 500 had been sold in a fortnight averted a prosecution. I was even prepared for a visit from Sir Felix Williams, our worthy squire, who seldom misses an opportunity of turning our local enthusiasms to account, and sometimes does me the honour to enlist my help. but scarcely for the turn his suggestions took. "You are, of course, interested in this movement," he began. "I have to be, seeing that I live in the midst of it. You have joined the ambulance class, I hear. Do you think I would neglect a precaution so obvious? Until their enthusiasm abates, I certainly shall range myself among the first aiders rather than the injured." "My idea was to strike while the iron is hot." "Oh," said I, "a town with so many in the fire." "And I thought perhaps we could manage to connect it in some way with the Primrose League." "But what can it have to do with the Primrose League?" I asked stiffly. I will admit now to a slight prejudice against the ambulance business, due perhaps to the lecturer's having chosen to start it in my absence. Sir Felix was disappointed and showed it. "Why, it was you," he reminded me, "who helped us last year by setting the widows to race for a leg of mutton." I was a symbolist in those days, and, excuse me, Sir Felix, it was not last year, but the year before. Last year we had the surrender of Cronje at Paardeberg, with the widows dressed up as Boer women. "Is that so? I thought we had Cronje 2 years ago, but no doubt you are right. Now I thought that with our Primrose Fete coming on, and everybody just now taking such an interest in the Empire—" "To be sure!" I cried. "First aid to the Empire. It will look well on the bills." Sir Felix rubbed his hands together, a trick of his when he is pleased. "It's an idea, eh? A brilliant one." "Well, but you haven't heard all." He looked at me almost slyly. "It occurred to me that while associating this enthusiasm of ours with the imperial idea, we might at the same time do a good turn for ourselves. You think that permissible?" "Permissible? For what else does an empire exist?" "Quite so. As I was saying to Lady Williams only this morning, we must bring home to less thoughtful persons a sense of its beneficence. Now, it occurs to me, why go on subscribing to these great public nursing funds in which our mite is a mere drop in the ocean, when, by sending up a nurse from our own town, she would, of course, be a member of the League, not only should we have the satisfaction of knowing that our help is effective, but the young woman would be earning a salary and supporting herself." "Admirable," said I. "It would look so much better in the papers, too." "You see, we have at this moment a score of young women, all natives of the town and members of the League, undergoing instruction from our lecturer. After the course there will be an examination, and then, with the lecturer's help, and the advice, if I might suggest it, of Lady Williams, who can tell him if the candidate's family be respectable and deserving, we can surely select a young person to do us credit." Sir Felix took his departure in the cheerfullest temper, and I record his suggestion as one eminently worthy of his head and his heart, although subsequent events have, alas, brought it to naught. I doubt if we shall send up a nurse from Troy. Indeed, I doubt if there will even be an examination. Last evening the Young Women's Christian Association attended its 6th ambulance lecture. The subject, roller bandaging, being a practical one, a small boy was had in, set on the platform, and bandaged in sight of the audience, plain bandaged, reverse bandaged, figure of 8 bandaged, bandaged on forefinger, thumb, hand, wrist and forearm, elbow, shoulder, knee, ankle, foot. He declares that he enjoyed himself thoroughly. After each demonstration the young women took a turn, and practised with such assiduity that an hour slipped pleasantly away. The bandages were applied, the spirals neatly stitched, and the stitches promptly snipped for the next pupil to begin. An occasional prick with the needle evoked no more than a playful remonstrance from the boy, and a ripple of laughter from the fair executants. At length, alas, Miss Sophie Rabling, in snipping her bandage from the boy's foot, fumbled, and drove a point of the scissors sharply into his toe. With a howl he caught at his foot, from which 1 or 2 drops of blood were trickling, and the sight of it so affected Miss Sophie that she dropped upon the platform in a swoon. A classmate in the body of the hall almost instantly followed her example. The lecturer, I am bound to say, behaved admirably. So far was he from losing his head that he instantly seized on the accident to turn it to account. "First aid!" he cried. "Subject fainting. Patient number 1. Head to be pressed down below her knees and kept there for a few minutes. Patient number 2 to be extended on the floor, care being taken to keep head and body level. A form being handy, we could, as an alternative, have hung patient number 1 over it, head downwards." But at this point, unfortunately, the humour of the situation became too much for Miss Gertrude Handsomebody, another of the students. She began to titter, went on to laugh uncontrollably, then to clench her hands and sob. "Subject, hysterics!" called the lecturer. "Treatment. Be firm with the patient, hold her firmly by the wrists, and threaten her with cold water." He spoke to empty benches. The rest of his pupils had escaped from the room, and were now on their way home, and running for dear life. I do not expect that St. John of Jerusalem will figure prominently in our primrose fate. My reason for saying so is an urgent letter just received from Sir Felix, who wishes to confer with me in the course of the day. End of section 17. Section 18 of The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The White Wolf and Other Fireside Tales by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Cox versus Prettyman. We are not litigious in Troy, and we obey the laws of England cheerfully if we sometimes claim to interpret them in our own way. I leave others to determine whether the chief constable's decision that 1 policeman amply suffices for us be an effect or a cause, but certain it is that we rarely trouble any court, and almost never that of a size. This accounts in part for the popular interest awakened by the suit of Cox versus Prettyman, heard a few days ago at the Bodmin Assizes. I say in part because the case presented, as the newspapers phrase it, some unusual features, and differed noticeably from the ordinary action for breach of promise. No harm in that, you will say. Indeed, no, and we should have regarded it as no more than our due, but for an apprehension that the conduct alleged against the defendant concerned us all by compromising the good name of our town. At any rate, last Wednesday found the streets full of citizens hurrying to the railway station, and throughout the morning our station master had difficulty in handling the traffic. The journey to Bodmin is not a long one, as the crow flies, but, as our carpenter, Mr. Handsomebody, put it, we are not crows, and that being the case, naturally resent being packed 16 in a compartment. Mr. Handsomebody taxed the Great Western Company with lack of foresight in not running excursion trains, and appealed to me to support his complaint. I argued, with the general approval of our fellow travellers, that there was something heartless in the idea of an excursion to listen to the recital of a woman's wrongs, especially of Miss Cox's, whom we had known so long and esteemed. Driven from this position, Mr. Handsomebody took a fresh stand on the superiority of the old broad-gauge carriages, and this, since it raised no personal question, we discussed in very good humour while we unpacked and ate our luncheons. In the midst of our meal, a lady at the far end of the compartment heaved a sigh and ejaculated, "Poor thing," which at once set us off discussing the case anew. We agreed that such conduct as Prettyman's was fortunately rare amongst us. We tried to disclaim him. No easy matter, since his father and mother had been natives of Troy, and he had spent all his life in our midst. The lady in the corner challenged Mr. Handsomebody to deny that our town was deteriorating, the rising generation more mischievous than its parents, and given to mitching from school and cigarette smoking, if not to worse. Now this was a really damaging attack, for Mr. Handsomebody not only presides over our school board, but has a son in the tobacco business. He met it magnificently. He would dismiss, he said, the cigarette question as one upon which, heaven knew with how little justice, he might be suspected of private bias. But on the question of truancy he had something to say, and he would say it. To begin with, he would admit that the children in Troy played truant. The percentage of school attendance was abnormally low. Yes, he admitted the fact, and thanked the lady for having called attention to it, since it bore upon the subject now uppermost in our minds. He had here, and he drew from his pocket a magazine article, some statistics to which he would invite our attention. They showed the average school attendance in Cornwall to be lower than in any county of England or Wales. But, and Mr. Handsomebody raised his forefinger, the same statistician in the very same paper proves the average of criminal prosecutions in Cornwall to be the lowest in England and Wales. "And you infer," I began, as he paused triumphantly. "I infer nothing, sir. I leave the inference to be drawn by our faddists in education, and I only hope they'll enjoy it." Well, apart from its bearing on Mr. Handsomebody's position as chairman of our board, which we forbore to examine, this discovery consoled us somewhat, and amused us a great deal, until we reached Bodmin, when we hurried at once to the assize court. I have said that the action, Cox versus Prettyman, was for damages for breach of promise of marriage. Both parties are natives and parishioners of Fowey, and attend the same place of worship. The plaintiff, Miss Rebecca Cox, earns her living as a dressmaker's assistant. The defendant is our watchmaker, and opened a shop of his own but a few months before approaching Miss Cox with proposals of marriage. This was 15 years ago. I may mention that some kind of counterclaim was put in for goods delivered, the goods in question being a musical box and sundry small articles for parlour amusement, such as a solitaire tray, 2 packs of patience cards, a race game, and the like. But the defendant did not allege that these had been sent or accepted as whole or partial quittance of his contract to marry, and I can only suppose that he pleaded them in mitigation of damages. Miss Cox asked for £150. Her evidence was given in quiet but resolute tones, and for some time disclosed nothing sensational. The circumstances in which Mr. Prettyman had sued for and obtained the promise of her hand differed in no important particular from those which ordinarily attend the fiançailles of respectable young persons in Troy, and for 12 years his courtship ran an even course. After this, asserted Miss Cox, his attentions cooled. He was friendly and kind enough when we met, and still talked of enlarging his shop front and marrying in the near future, but his visits were not frequent enough to be called courting. Of late, though living in the same street, she had only seen him on Sundays, and even so he would be occupied almost all the day and evening with services, Sunday school, prayer meetings, and occasional addresses. At length she taxed him with indifference, and, finding his excuses unsatisfactory, was persuaded by her friends to bring the present action. She liked the man well enough, but for the last 2 or 3 years his heart hadn't been in it. He didn't do any proper courting. Defendant's counsel, a young man, attempted in cross-examination to lead Miss Cox to reveal herself as an exacting young woman. "Do you assert that at length you came to see nothing of defendant during the week?" "Only through the shop window as I went by to my work, and of late when he saw me coming he would screw a magnifying glass in his eye and pretend to be busy with his watchmaking. I believe he did it to avoid looking at me, and also because I couldn't bear him with his face screwed up. It makes such a difference to his appearance." "Gently, gently, Miss Cox. You must not give us your mere suppositions. Now, did he never pay you a visit, or take you for a walk, say on Wednesdays? That would be early closing day, I believe." "Never for the last 3 years, sir, after he became a Freemason. Wednesdays was lodge night." "Well, then, on Saturday, after shop hours?" "Yes, he used to come on Saturdays, till he was made a forester. The foresters meet every Saturday evening." "Mondays, then, or Tuesdays? We haven't exhausted the week yet, Miss Cox." "No, sir. Mondays he was a Rechabite and went to tent. Tuesdays he would be an ancient Druid." "Gently. On Mondays you say he was a Rechabite and went to tent. What is a Rechabite, and what does he do in a tent?" Plaintiff, dissolving in tears. "Oh, sir, if I only knew!" Here the judge interposed. A Rechabite, he believed, went to a tent, or habitation, for the purpose, among others, of abstaining from alcoholic drinks. Plaintiff, briskly. "But, my lord, you wouldn't call that proper courting." Defendant's counsel had taken this opportunity to resume his seat, but counsel for the plaintiff now arose, with a smile, to re-examine. "Did Mr. Prettyman walk out with you on Thursday evenings?" "Oh, no, sir. On Thursday evenings Mr. Prettyman was an odd fellow." "I think we have only to account for Fridays," said his lordship, after consulting his notes. "On Fridays, my lord, Mr. Prettyman was an ancient buffalo." "An ancient buffalo?" "Yes, my lord," sobbing. "I don't know what it means, but that was the last straw." "The first question for the jury to determine," said his lordship a little later, "is whether an affianced young woman, as such, has a right to expect from her betrothed such attentions as may reasonably be taken as earnest of his desire to fulfil his contract within a reasonable time. In the present instance, the fact that the contract was made does not stand in doubt. It is not disputed. Now arises a second question. Can a man who is on weekdays a Freemason, a Rechabite, an Odd Fellow, a Forester, an ancient Druid, and an ancient Buffalo, and on Sundays, as I gather, a Yarmouth Bloater—" "Plymouth Brother, my lord," plaintiff's counsel corrected. I beg your pardon, a Plymouth Brother. I say, can a man who after his betrothal voluntarily preoccupies himself with these multifarious functions be held, I will not say to have disqualified himself for that willing exchange of confidence which is the surest guarantee of lasting happiness between man and wife, but to have raised such obstacles to the fulfilment of the original contract as reasonably warrant the accusation of mala fidus. Well, the jury held that he could, for without troubling to leave the box they gave their verdict for the plaintiff and assessed the damages at £100. Towards the close of the case we all felt ashamed of Prettyman. His defence had been weak. It struck us as almost derisory, and Mr. Handsomebody agreed with me in a whisper that under similar circumstances he or I could have made a better fight for it. The fellow had shown no sport. We blushed for our town. But Troy has a knack of winning its races on the post. Judgment, as the phrase goes, was on the point of being entered accordingly, when the defendant looked up towards the bench with a sudden happy smile. "Here, wait a minute," he said. "I have a question to put to his lordship." "Eh?" said the judge. "Certainly. What is it?" "I want to know, my lord, if I can claim the benefit of the First Offenders Act." The train on the return journey was worse crowded than ever, but nobody minded, for we had managed to give plaintiff and defendant a compartment to themselves. End of section 18.